could say something about the commonly used notion of unconditional love in the New Age movement. And the second thing that came up for me was if you could say something about divine justice as a concept, as an opposite half to divine love.
So divine justice and unconditional love.
And the notion of like God's love being unconditional.
Yeah, they're both very good questions. Shall we start with the unconditional love question? What is your understanding, or what do you feel the New Age understanding is of unconditional love?
I personally feel I've sat with it quite a lot and asked a lot of people about it, and I've come to the conclusion that I just think that the concept is impossible, because conditionality is inextricably linked in existence, and so it's a nice term, and I think it can make people feel good about themselves, or hide away from the raw truth of life. But I actually think it's an erroneous concept. Potentially, I'm being humble about it. I'm approaching it with an open mind, but to me,
I feel a lot of people would agree with it. And I know a lot of men that I've spoken to in particular agree with it. That they don't understand how there can be this idea or concept of unconditional love when there's conditions everywhere in the universe. So, for example, if we look at God's laws, there is a law that involves what I call the law of compensation, which is if you do something out of harmony with love, there's an automatic effect on your soul that causes you pain. Right? Now, a lot of people would see that as God being punishing, whereas I still see that as God being loving. But if you see it as God being punishing, then there's no such thing as unconditional love. Does that make sense? So it just depends on your definition, I suppose, is what I'm getting at. But let's look at the issue of unconditional love. What I feel God's love is, I do feel God's love is unconditional in this regard. God has as much love for you if you ignore God completely, or you want to connect to God, or you hate God, or any other concept that you could have of God applies. God still has the same amount of love ready to give to you in her. That's my understanding. Based on my personal experience. Over 2,000 years, that's my understanding. Now to me that is unconditional in the sense that it doesn't matter what you do, God still feels this feeling of love for you.
So could I just come back with saying that, so the term justice is almost a human interpretation of God's high love.
Yeah, almost, because I'll talk about justice in a minute, because there is certainly divine justice as a concept that is a part of this love, and we'll talk about that. But do you understand what I said as the first part of your answer?
Oh yeah, I really like it, yeah.
Now that does not mean that love will enter you, because there is conditions under which that love can enter you, which are fully under your control, not God's. Do you follow? So what I'm saying is, if this is your soul, and this is God's soul, God's got this love all the time, independent of what you do, for you. You can be a murderer, a rapist, a tax collector, as they used to be back in the first century, who were often condemned as much as those first two. And God still has the same amount of love ready to give you. But that love can only enter you under the condition that you allow it. And the way you allow it is by coming in harmony with truth and being humble and desiring it. There has to be also this desire for the love to enter you. Otherwise, you can't. So can you see, in that regard, the conditions all surround our own choice rather than God's. Can you see that?
I can, but part of me feels like we are a much further out layer of God. I mean, I'm not saying that I am God, but we are in the same reality, right? So there is this barrier, which to me is a conditional layer. It is a conditional layer. And
see, I don't see it as that, because I see that love has qualities, and part of the qualities of love are truth and humility. In fact, the more loving you become, the more humble you become. The more loving you become, the more truthful you become. And because I see them as interwoven as a part of the, if you could term it, the qualities of love, then I don't see it as a separateness. I just see it as a choice which revolves around one particular quality that God gave us, and that is this ability for us to have free will, which is a tremendously important concept with regard to your own development. If you can exercise your will in any direction, God gave you the ability to exercise your will even in a direction that's completely disharmonious with love. You can exercise your will in a terrible direction in terms of the results that it creates. And there are people historically on the earth who have literally murdered millions and millions of people because of the will they had to exercise their will in a direction out of harmony with love. Right? Now that is a choice that is made by that particular individual based on their desires, their being out of harmony with truth, and them having no humility. When you bring yourself into more humility and truth, and you have a desire to connect to God, then as this love transforms you, it also causes you to even see how to exercise your free will in a more loving manner. And it's that basic understanding that I feel is involved with love. If we can understand that love is very much about truth, humility and love, rather than just love as a separate quality that we're trying to define, in the sense that love cannot flow without there being truth and humility in the recipient. So if you love me and I don't let you, I don't allow you to, then I'm not going to feel your love no matter how much love you have for me. I might even think that you hate me even when you love me, based on my own emotions and feelings. And this is the problem that we face with God. And a lot of the times I feel we are judging God based on our own condition, rather than seeing God as someone who desires to love us and care for us all of our lives and give us all the love that we have the capacity to receive. And by the way, the capacity to receive God's love grows as our soul grows. So theoretically, we could have as almost, in the end, if God's infinite in nature, which at this stage my understanding is that if God is infinite, if God's infinite in nature and infinite in love, then theoretically I can receive personally an infinite amount of God's love. And if that's what I'm capable of doing, then that tells me that God obviously has all of this unconditional love for me. The only condition is whether I choose through my will to receive it or not. That's the condition. So if you're saying, is there a condition on receiving God's love? Definitely. And the condition is you must use your will to receive it. God will not give you anything, including love, against your will. Right? Does everyone understand that? It's very important to understand that. God will not give you anything against your will. You have to want it. Does that answer that question about unconditional love?
I was with you right until that last sentence you mentioned, and now I feel like, but you know,
God's got all the love ready to give.
If our will isn't aligned with God, we still live and we still breathe, and you know. So I could say, but actually, God is still loving me because I'm still in existence.
I agree, but can I just clarify something here? When I'm talking about divine love, I am talking about the substance of God's personal love for you, not God's general love for all of God's creation. And there's a very big difference between those two types of love. It's the same as you with regard to other things. You have a specific type of love for your partner that is unique in its nature, isn't it? It's not the same as you have for your best friend. Do you see that?
Sure.
Different type of love. And what I'm suggesting to you is that God has a general love which all humanity, and not only humanity, but all of God's creatures and all of God's universe receives every single moment automatically. And I'm not talking about that as the divine love. The divine love is a personal love that God has to give you as long as you exercise your will to desire it. It will be received. And that's the different love. Do you understand?
Yeah.
That's what I'm getting at there. And in terms of that being unconditional, that is certainly unconditional with the exception that we have to use our will to receive it. Whereas the other type of love, which I said in the first century, God makes it rain upon the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, God has the amount of love for all of us that all of our basic necessities and needs are cared for if we use them appropriately and wisely, which many on the earth aren't doing at the moment. But if that is done, then everyone will get fed, and everyone would get water, and everyone would get shelter, and so forth. God provided enough for all of that to occur. But that is a generalised love. What we used to use the term in the first century, in Greek, agape, which is a love based on principle or equality. Right? What I'm talking about when I'm talking about God's love, divine love, is God's personal love for you as an individual. A relationship love, just like you have a relationship with a partner, but far more intense because it's coming from God. So that was the first part of your question. The second part of your question was about justice.